who we've got in the meeting room. So I'm just going to open this poll now. So the polls are open. So if you could just have a read through those options, select one option that you associate yourself with, and then we'll have a look at the demographic. So I'm just keeping those polls open until they start to balance out. And I'm going to close the poll in 10 seconds. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Polls are closed, and I'm just waiting for them to just give us our result.
Oh, good. Andy, all well?
Okay. Well, I'm hoping that you can all see those poll results now. Again, just to ask everybody just to mute out while the speakers are speaking. Yeah. So it's a really good mix of people that we've got on the line today. Everybody from the Environment Agency, a good representation from engineering consultants, the lead local authorities, got some IDBs in the mix as well. Yeah, so that's interesting and indicative of exactly the right audience that we're trying to target at the moment. Okay, so just to go through the structure of today's webinar, got a very short introduction from myself to as why we've done this research and published this new guide, and then we're going to hear from the authorship team themselves to take us through the underpinning principles of the guide. We're going to have a very short break for some questions and answers at that point. If I could encourage you to submit your questions via the chat function, which is in the top right-hand corner of the software box. You can either direct your question direct to the presenter, or you can open it up to everyone. During that question and answer slot, I'll take a few questions. We might not get round to answering them all, but we'll keep track of all of those questions and provide an answer to them after the webinar. After that question and answer session, we're going to go into a little bit more depth about the methods and the hierarchical framework which actually underpins the guidance that we're putting forward, and then have a bit of a wrap-up and some conclusions, at which point you will have been taken through the complete research publication, and we'll give you another opportunity for questions and answers at that point. I just want to start by introducing the project authorship team and the governance that we've put around this project. So the project's been delivered by Royal Haskoning DHV, Fola Ogunui, Eddie Robinson and Thijs van Brink at Royal Haskoning DHV. They've been leading a consortium consisting of Paul Sayers from Sayers and Partners, and John Ash has been instrumental to advising the project throughout its development. John was actually the previous author, or one of the previous authors of the past Fluvial Freeboard Guide, report W187. The project team have been supported by a project board. The project executive has been Jackie Banks of our asset and engineering performance team, and we've had two lead business users representing various parts of the business, so Tim Hunt from our National Modelling and Forecasting team and Andrew Eden from our SCRM Planning and Regulations team. The project has been kept in check throughout by a project advisory group who were selected really to be broadly representative of the audience for this new guide. So why did we start this research project, and why do we feel that we needed a new guide? Well, really the current freeboard guide, Fluvial Freeboard Guide report W187 was actually written in 1998, published in 2000, so the contents of that guide is well over 16 years old now. And in that time, obviously, significant changes have been made in terms of tools and methods that we use to underpin our flood risk management decision making. We've seen a shift, a paradigm shift from flood defence to very much flood risk management. And report W187, obviously, as it says in the title, was only targeting fluvial situations. And during our review of that previous piece of work and some of the case study work and our literature review, we've come across a number of ambiguities and potentially some inconsistencies in the approach to freeboard and the inclusion of things like climate change allowances and factors of safety. So with this new guide, we've really tried to take the opportunity to address those ambiguities. And of course, we recognise that uncertainty is pervasive in all of our decisions in terms of flood risk management, but actually sometimes it's not actually possible to remove all uncertainties, and in some cases perhaps it's not even desirable or logical to do so. And one of the underpinning principles of the guide is that managing future uncertainties are actually better delivered through either a precautionary approach in terms of inbuilt precautionary allowances or a managed adaptive approach. And we'll be hearing more about those key underlying principles and how they fit in with freeboard or residual uncertainty as we move through this presentation. This was a real key diagram in the old Fluvial Freeboard Guide, which actually set out the two principal components of freeboard, and we like to refer back to this diagram to really highlight the fundamental difference between the new residual uncertainty allowance and the old Fluvial Freeboard Guide. So the old Fluvial Freeboard Guide recommended two broad groups of uncertainties to be accounted for within freeboard. One group looking at the actual physical processes which might take place or impinge on a defence or an earth embankment, such as settlement and deterioration or degradation. And the other group are those adverse uncertainties in the prediction of those physical processes or prediction of hydrology and the hydraulics within the channel itself. What we do with this new guide is actually separate those processes out, and we're actually saying that when we can predict or model those physical processes, they no longer become an issue for freeboard or uncertainty. So we're trying to just separate those two processes out. And again, this point will run throughout the whole of the presentation. We'll see it again in the principles later on. But really key difference between this guide and the old guidance is the separation of these two categories of physical processes and the inherent remaining uncertainties. So just to drill down in a little bit more detail about some of the differences between the old freeboard guide and what we're now looking to promote. So the old freeboard guide was really physically process focused, and the new guide we're starting to take you through a lot more of a structured approach to the identification and management of uncertainties. The old guide, we felt that actually some certain aspects were included as elements of freeboard. So for an example of that might be a settlement rate of the defence, and that settlement rate might have been accounted for within the actual design of the defence, and then another allowance was actually built in for freeboard. So we're really trying to separate out those things that perhaps have been already accounted for within the design or the appraisal process. There was no clear link between strategy and design and how uncertainty might be managed in the strategy development phase and how uncertainties were being managed in the design phase. So we're really trying to make that link and ensure that the management of uncertainty is a continuous process through the investment journey really of a flood defence scheme. The old guide only prescribed a single response to the management of uncertainty, and that response is a crest level raising through freeboard. With the new guidance, we recognise that we use a portfolio of measures to manage risk in this new flood risk management paradigm, and again, a portfolio of measures is equally applicable to managing uncertainty. So we encourage you to think widely. Within the old guidance, there was also some ambiguity about whether or not climate change allowances were built into the hydrological assessment, for example. And this guide is very clear about it's about managing present-day uncertainties and climate change, and those future uncertainties are better managed through either precautionary allowances or an adaptive approach. So we've arrived at a definition which we're looking to replace the term freeboard with. So we arrived at the definition of a residual uncertainty allowance, which is an allowance that seeks to assure present-day performance by accounting for all of those uncertainties that have not explicitly been addressed elsewhere, either in the planning, appraisal, design or implementation process. So really this is trying to drill down to ensure that we're not duplicating and double counting uncertainties throughout that process. This is a really key slide, and I must highlight and focus on this at the moment. As with all research outputs, we've published this output for guidance and guidance only. It's currently not mandated within the Environment Agency, and certainly we are not saying that projects that are underway should revise their cases to take account of this guide. New projects that might be in the pipeline, then certainly it's worthwhile having a look at the guide and its applicability with your Environment Agency or other clients. And currently the EA is actually reviewing the guide and working out a plan to how we actually uptake and mandate certain elements or all of the guide. So we're actually working with our National Engineering and Innovation Panel, and we'll be working through our various communities of practice to actually roll the guide out and mandate it. Okay, at this point I'm going to hand you over to the authorship team, and I'd like you to introduce you to Fola Organui from Royal Haskelley. Fola, you can unmute your line by pressing *6.
Thank you very much, Owen. As Owen has alluded to, there were quite a number of issues with the previous guide that this new guide is trying to address. It's really got into the why, and what I'll try to do now is start to look at the what methods that we actually apply to this. Some of the issues like the move from defense to flood risk management, which means embracing the wider flood risk management. We can't just continue to deal with fluvial uncertainties, but make it broader. That automatically meant that we have to think of other things as part of this. So, as Owen has mentioned, it's a new name for the new guide, and we decided also to come up with a set of principles that will capture what we need to do to address those issues. The whole of the guide has been developed in the concept of principles, issues, methods, and examples, and really the idea is that the whole of the guide is underpinned by a set of principles. We've got 5 principles that were developed to underpin the whole of the guide, and I'll go through them one by one. The first principle is the need to challenge the credibility of the system. Here, the idea is that one is really understanding the system they're working with. It's the idea of taking a structured approach to the way uncertainty allowance is managed, going through a thought process in doing that. Take an example here, understanding the different loadings the different loadings affecting whatever what it's doing, and understanding how that comes together and the parameters we're using, and being able to go back to understand the completeness of them. Have we actually accounted for all the different loading conditions that might affect what we're doing? And if we haven't, know why we haven't. And even for each of the attributes we're using, starting to go back to understand the uncertainties within the source, the pathway, and the receptor. Take an example, if you were looking at understanding the tolerable limits of overtopping to a defense, you've got some wave overtopping information from some model, understanding the uncertainties within that, understanding the uncertainties of the crest level that you're using, and then working that back into the kind of things like the water levels, the wave climate, and all those that actually give rise to that wave overtopping information, and understanding the uncertainties through all that process, which actually makes the whole of these a thought process. So at the beginning, you're being diverse. You're thinking of what all the different issues might be, understanding how certain and how uncertain that process is. So unfortunately, for someone who is looking for a figure, 400 mil to add to a defense, this is not what the guide tries to do. So it's about understanding and being able to represent the system as it is. The second principle is about considering the reality of the present day. So here, as opposed to the previous guide, the uncertainty allowance is for what you can see in front of you today. We've intentionally not try to capture future things like climate change and development change within the uncertainty allowance. We really feel that things like this are best addressed, particularly climate change, are best addressed through sort of trade-off, through the appraisal process, understanding what the scale is through whatever guidance is available, and then taking the right decisions as to how you might deal with that instead of just applying that as some sort of uncertainty allowance. Moving on to the third principle, this is about exploring a range of measures to manage the uncertainty. Now here, again, this is one of the key things that we've had to introduce, particularly bringing in other sorts of flooding like coastal and other bits where the usual response of so many millimeters, let's just add that in, doesn't really work, or where you've got a defense where it's more about the risk of breach to a defense and just adding something on top of it doesn't work. So the thinking here then is to really explore, having understood what uncertainties are within your process, having understood which ones have already been accounted for within your journey so far, then this is about looking at what is next and looking at the source, pathway, receptor areas and looking at the appropriate ways to deal with them, which might be a way within the source, the pathway of the receptor. It might be a combination of ways. But the important thing is not feeling restricted to a raising of some level, but actually using appropriate measures as necessary. The fourth principle is about ensuring the proportionate response, which probably doesn't need introducing in these days of the need to look at proportionality. This is particularly important as we widen this from fluvial defenses to other forms of defenses, and also into the whole planning system, that the appropriate effort is given to understanding uncertainty and then accounting for what is left. Also, for the different types of potential users and users of this, it should recognize that so that we're not trying to use a sledgehammer to deal with everything else. The fifth principle is recognizing that management of uncertainty is a continuous process. It's the whole life management through the process of a project, and the fact that even from strategic levels of understanding and putting data together, it's about understanding what uncertainties are in what we're using, which ones we've dealt with, which ones remains, and actually recording that properly as we go through the process so that when it's time to look at some uncertainty allowance for the next stage, then the information is there. And hopefully, as this guide starts to embed itself, we will get better at recording these uncertainties and analyzing them. That's the end of the sort of understanding of the principles, and I'll now hand over to Owen.
Thanks, Fola. So just to break up the slides, I think it's right to stop for a moment here and just see if we've got any questions. So if you've got a burning question, can I encourage you to use the chat function and just submit either your question to everyone, make it visible to everyone, or direct it to myself or Fola. Okay, so I'm just going to wait for 20 seconds or so just to see if we've got any questions coming in. There's nothing coming in yet. Okay, well, Fola, no burning questions at this point, so that's fine. Well, one just coming in, just as I said that. Okay,
thank you, Owen.
Well, no, so just one moment, Fola. Just a couple of questions coming in now, which I think is probably worth just dealing with. The present day performance was mentioned. Does this not consider the whole life cycle of the defence? Fola, would you like to consider that?
Yes. When we're designing the defence, we're obviously designing it to be active and performing for a period of time into the future. But in terms of residual uncertainty, we believe that the information that supports what happens to the defence in the future, such as climate change, such as settlement and things like that, should be properly assessed and part of the design of that defence, as opposed to just sticking something in as a residual uncertainty. So we think that a lot of the future considerations need to be more clearly looked at. Also, the way you deal with the future might be that you might have a stepped approach and an adaptive approach to that, which is again why we're quite keen not to use residual uncertainty to deal with it. It's not that it's not important, but we don't feel that should be the role for a residual uncertainty allowance.
Okay, Fola, thanks for that. I've got another question here, which I think is particularly pertinent and gets right to the issue. Does the project team think that the move to this new guide will result in increased freeboard levels? Paul, can I perhaps direct that question to yourself? You might need *6 to unmute. Hi, Paul. Did you get that? Okay. Well, as Paul wrestles with the mute function, Fola, can I ask for a response to that question?
Okay. Yeah. Thanks. I think we actually did a number of pilot studies and tests of this with a huge range of development planning outcomes and things. And what it looks like is, in some cases it might be less, in some cases it might be more. But the reality is that what we're doing now is we're properly understanding and accounting for it. So if it's more than it used to be, that's probably because we were perhaps deluding ourselves before, as opposed to us adding anything else. Because what this is doing is providing a structured approach to assessing things properly, making sure that all the things that have been accounted for by all sorts of other means within the design or with safety factors are not double counted. So what you see is what it should be. So there is a chance that in some cases it could be higher, others it could be lower, but the more important thing is that it should be more accurate than it used to be.
Okay, Fola, thank you for that. Just one more question. There was a flurry of questions in then, and we will take the time to respond to everybody's question after the webinar. Just one that I would like to pick up on at this point was, is there a plan to give the business time to start using the guidance and perhaps organise follow-up surgeries to exchange experiences, etc.? Yes, very much so. We're starting to work on the implementation plan. We envisage that we'll hopefully select some front-runner sites within the Environment Agency where we'd like to roll the guidance out and trial it. And we'll very much be tapping into our existing communities of practice to share experience with the use of the guide. So, yeah, some really good suggestions there, and hopefully we'll be picking up on those. Okay, we'll pick up the rest of those questions. There's some really good stuff coming in, so we'll pick up as many as we can in the next question session, and if we don't specifically answer your question today, then we will certainly be writing back to you. Okay, Fola, do you want to carry on with the presentation?
Okay, thank you, Owen. So at this next stage, we're starting to move into the actual methods, so the how of this guide, and this will be supported by a few illustrations. Important thing about the method is we recognize the the proportionality principle, and we've tried to understand. We've come up with different methods for different types of application. For example, for doing planning and development control plan approvals on the floodplain, there is a multi-criteria confidence scoring approach, which is a bit more focused and in line with one of the options we had in the previous guide, but this actually fleshes it out a lot more so it can be used at that level of development planning. We've also got, for people who are appraising from the earliest stage of appraising all the way through to designing flood management options, quantified approaches to actually do that, and there's a tiered approach within that. And also for those managing existing flood defenses and wanting to understand what the current performance of those defenses are, again, there are approaches to deal with that. There's an overall framework which we've developed to really support this method, and it's in 4 stages. The first bit is quite a divergent bit where you are just looking in the context of principle 1 to understand and record all the primary sources of uncertainty that are associated with the parameters that you're using and working back to understand that. Then you move into a stage where you try to understand the ones which have been accounted for in the work so far, so that you're left with the residual uncertainty. And then you try to estimate and understand the scale and magnitude of those residual uncertainties. And a final stage, which perhaps is one of the key additions in this, determining the appropriate response. It might not just be simple raising as we've done before. What I'll then try to do now is to perhaps show how this has been applied to a number of the different type of use scenarios. The first one is the one for development planning. Here, the way we put those stages in 4 slightly different steps. The first step within this is that we provide a set list of sources of uncertainty, again, because for this kind of users, things need to be quite more streamlined. So you actually choose from those set lists which ones are relevant to your scenario. For example, if there are no groundwater issues or surface water issues, or you're not in a coastal area, you will perhaps recognize that those ones are not relevant. And then you estimate the magnitude of those uncertainties through a matrix that we provide to assess the confidence score. You then take the 2 highest of the confidence scores. By the highest, I mean the ones where you have least confidence in, and then there's a matrix that you use to derive what is the minimum depth of uncertainty allowance. And then you move to a step 4, which is about determining the appropriate response, which could be just using that depth of allowance, but recognizing that there might be some other things you might be able to do as well, working with the planning authority. This is a table that illustrates the first step. Basically, on the left, you've got the considerations that we provided with typical questions, that you need to answer, like, how good is the floodplain topography that's been used for the model? What's the confidence in the hydrology? How has the fluvial threat been represented, or surface water or groundwater? And also, what's the strength of the evidence, really looking at, calibration, validation, and things like that. First thing, you decide whether it's applicable or not. For example, if there's no coastal threat or something, that would be no. If there's no defense, because, it's just, there's no formal high defense, then how the defense failure being modeled will not be applicable. And then on the right side, it gives you a place to actually say what your reasons are, why it is, especially when you say it is not relevant. Then you move to the next step. here we've developed a matrix for each of those considerations. I'm just showing two of them here, just by way of illustration. For each of them, there are 5 levels of confidence from very unlikely to be locally reliable to highly likely to be locally reliable. And there are developed a number of descriptors that will allow you to depending on how the data you've used and the provenance of that data, to be able to give the right score to your bid. Just taking, for example, the strength of the evidence. So the very unlikely score 10, there's no evidence that the models have been calibrated or even validated. So that's the worst one. And then when it's been calibrated against multiple events of less frequency than the design event, then you go to the other end. So all the other ones have been done in that kind of manner. Once you've done that, you then will have the score for each of those relevant bits. You then pick the 2 highest scores, and those 2 highest scores will be combined to give you a star rating. Again, the thinking behind this is that the 2 worst scores are likely to be driving the whole uncertainty. And then once you've decided on the star, you then look at the table below. That automatically leads you to some minimum depth of allowance. Now, that minimum depth will relate to what you need to add to your actual levels in terms of development planning for things like floor levels. But while it gives you that, there is a next step where that could be used in that way, or you might choose to look at the areas where you have very low confidence score, and just by doing a little bit of improvement, perhaps in the hydrology or something else, if that's what's driving it, or just not bother to validate or calibrate, and there might be some data you could use for that, then that improves the confidence and that reduces the allowance you need to make. Now, again, along thinking about proportionality, it's looking at what is right and the right levels for those, and so there's a potential to do that, or there's a potential to raise the property threshold with the allowance, or have some combination of resilience, property rating, and things, again in discussion with the local planning authority. So that's the way that actually works. What I'll now do is perhaps just illustrate that with a bit of an example. In this case, you've gone through each of the appropriate issues. The ones that are applicable have been identified, and we've got those scoring using the matrix. So if you look at those, you see that the 2 highest ones are 5 and 3. So using those 5 and 3, that is then taken to the matrix, which in this case gives you a 2-star, and the 2-star gives you a 750 mil. And what you then do with that 750 mil is either you apply it as it is, or use some of those other steps that are described earlier. What I'll now do is I'll pass on to Paul Sayers, who will go through the 2 other methods, the 2 other uses. Paul.
Thanks, Fowler. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can, Paul.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you fine, Paul.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you fine, Paul.
Excellent, thanks, Fowler. So, yeah, I'll now move on to, following on from those discussions, to think about the applicability to strategy and scheme development. And it uses the same basic framework where we're trying to get the designer or the appraiser to think through all of the uncertainties that might be of relevance, and think of those that have been accounted for previously, and then think how best to address them. So that same basic framework exists in the design or an appraisal frame as it did in the planning frame. And we can see that on this slide. We've still got those same 4 stages. But there's a slight difference. So I'll go through them now in the context of the strategy and scheme developer, because there's a slight difference in how much freedom the designer or the appraiser has. But in stage 1, we're still looking to identify a primary source of uncertainty. And an example of that, for example, on this diagram here, is the in-river water level. Might be an example of a primary uncertainty. And then we're expecting people to think through, well, okay, what are the contributory uncertainties to that primary one? So the floodplain representation, perhaps, the design hydrology, the channel geometry. But we're also asking people to think through, is their analysis complete? So not only what are the data and model uncertainties, but have they represented that system in a complete way? So an example here might be that the hydraulic analysis has been undertaken in the absence of, on the assumption that defences are absent, and water levels estimated on that basis, but in reality there are some defences, so we would be looking for people to identify that is an incomplete element of the analysis and try and make some assessment of the importance of that. So once all the primary sources have been identified and their contributories, then we're thinking in stage 2, as Fowler outlined in the same framework, which of those certainties have already been accounted for elsewhere, either in previous appraisals or through allowances that might be used, as we heard earlier, settlement or even climate change allowances. So that leaves a series of residual uncertainties that we have to take account of, we have to think through and perhaps address through a residual uncertainty allowance. And to do that, we've outlined in the guide 2 levels of complexity of approach. One is what we call a first order analysis that was in the previous guide as well, and one is based on sampling and simulation. So I'll just give an illustration of how that looks. So here we go. We see a river cross-section, and our sticking with the primary source of uncertainty of interest around the in-river water level. We identify what that is.
Okay.
And we then think, okay, let's think what are those secondary variables that influence that primary variable. So in this case, design hydrology, channel hydrology, etc. This diagram also shows tertiary sources of uncertainty that I won't go into in this presentation, but you could just continue with this hierarchical view and think, well, okay, what are the uncertainties that contribute to channel geometry, for example? But in this example, I just think about the primary and the secondary sources. And then what we look to do in a first-order error analysis is say, what would a small change in those secondary variables, how would that affect a change in the primary variable? So that's what we call delta R over delta X, small change in R, that primary variable of interest, over a change in the secondary variable. So for example, 20% reduction in cross-sectional area, delta X, might increase the 100-year water level by 0.1 of a metre. And that goes into the equation that you can see below. I won't say too much about that here, but the important thing is that the secondary variables, we're understanding how they each individually, a small change in those influence the primary uncertainty. Then when we understand how they relate to each other, the guide sets out that you have to say, well, what evidence have you got for the plausible range in that secondary variable? So, for example, it might say that ground truthing, you've done a few cross-sectional surveys in more detail at some specific places with a bit of a longer record, and that suggests perhaps that the cross-sectional data that you're using might be in 10% in error. So I've now got an understanding of how much error I might have in each of those secondary uncertainties and how they relate to an uncertainty in that primary in-river water level. And in the first-order error analysis, I combine those together through a simple weighting function. And the equation is at the bottom of that diagram, but probably easier if I just highlight how that's done in a table. So here we have a table that says the thing that we're interested in, the primary uncertainty we're interested in, is the 100-year design water level. And then it's got the secondary uncertainties in the table. So, for example, the design hydrology, the roughness, channel geometry, and we've also made an estimate of how important that upstream floodplain storage might be, inaccuracies in that, in how it influences in-river water levels. And then I think about the uncertainty in each of those individual parameters and how they are weighted to contribute to the in-river water level, and then I can sum them up with the equation that was on the previous slide, and it's in the guide. I can sum those up directly, really very simply, to get an overall uncertainty in the in-river water level. So all of those secondary uncertainties come together to give me about a 0.22 metres of uncertainty in the 100-year water level. So I'm now clear through this table which uncertainties I've considered, how important I think each one is, and what their values are, and the overall uncertainty I've got in the in-river water level. There's a few simplifications in how that's done, so that's assuming that all the errors are independent, but it gives you a very easy way of bringing together those multiple secondary uncertainties into that primary uncertainty of in-river water level. The guide also talks about more comprehensive analysis in a similar way to the previous guide, with a bit more detail. But it talks about uncertainty and sensitivity analysis, and it promotes the idea that you could undertake a scenario-based sensitivity analysis, which is effectively a what-if type approach, where you perturb one of the uncertainties and then you observe how that influences the outputs. So that won't tell you a quantified amount of uncertainty that you have on the in-river water level, for example, but it will tell you how sensitive that is to different variations in channel cross-section, variation in roughness, etc. So it suggests that, sets out some approaches for that, but it also talks about much more complete simulation-based approaches, so Monte Carlo type analysis, and linking that with more formal sensitivity analysis, that you can then start identifying or quantifying the uncertainty on in-river water level, or even on expected annual damages, and attributing that uncertainty back to the individual parameters. So how much is the uncertainty you have on channel roughness actually influencing the uncertainty on the in-river water level, taking into account that there are other uncertainties as well. So it's a very powerful approach, and there's a bit more discussion in the guide around those. I won't go into them here though. And then finally, again, it's that idea of determining an appropriate response, and the guide sets out a framework for deciding when you've done enough analysis, and the key things are in these red boxes. So if we look at the first one, it says, is action needed to manage the residual uncertainty? So maybe not, maybe you just have to accept it. But if action is needed, it says, does the cost of taking action influence the option choice or the decision to proceed? And if the answer is no to that, you say, well, I've done enough analysis, I can now either accept that residual uncertainty or modify my design or my plan without doing any further analysis. But if the cost of addressing that residual uncertainty is so high that it would modify the way you go about managing risk, it might change it from one particular option to a different type of option, then it says, well, hang on, really, you shouldn't be addressing that with a residual uncertainty analysis, but you should be thinking a bit more carefully about the appraisal process and incorporating some of those uncertainties in the appraisal process. And this next slide is just reinforcing that, and it's reinforcing in our new approach, we have a much closer handshake, if you like, between design and appraisal and vice versa. It again repeats the idea that addressing freeboard as a residual uncertainty within the appraisal stage adds cost but no benefit. So if you address those residual uncertainties in the appraisal stage by adding something to the crest height, for example, the cost of that adds to the option cost but not to the benefits. Okay, so just as a last few slides, one of the underlying issues that has changed with a more explicit representation of uncertainty is, well, okay, how does that influence our standard of protection statements, which are normally quite deterministic and quite single statements. So we address that in the guide and suggest that standard protection should be represented as a range, and I'll illustrate that just through a graph. So here we see the 1 over the annual exceedance probability, i.e. the return period on the x-axis, and then the overtopping rate on the y-axis. Now, if we are thinking about the ultimate limit state, so when a breach might happen, we could think of the upper limit of acceptable overtopping, that top red line, and perhaps we've got a lower limit of acceptable overtopping for structural damage at the bottom red line. So we've got uncertainty in the what level of overtopping is acceptable from a structural failure point of view. And then we've also got uncertainty in the return period of the overtopping that's taken into account, certainly in the waves and the water levels, etc. So if we plot those on, the black line there is perhaps what we would typically take. So we might take a central estimate of what the overtopping rate threshold is, acceptable overtopping rate, and that might give us a value of, say, 105 years of the standard of protection. So that's our expected value is 105 years. But we recognize now that it can be quite a wide range. So if we take the lower limit of acceptable overtopping and the higher limit of overtopping rate, then it could be as low as 40 years. And then vice versa, it could be as high as 200 years. So it's somewhere between, in the range of 40 to 200 years as a standard of protection against breach. So in the guide, it suggests that we should be speaking both about that ultimate limit state, which is based on the possibility of breach. So for an ultimate limit state here, the defence has a standard between it could be as low as 100 or as high as 300 years, but it's on 200 years on average. But we also introduced the concept of a serviceability limit state. So it might be something to do with access to the promenade that is controlling what the acceptable overtopping rate is. So we should be also expressing the standard of protection associated with that serviceability limit state, but again, a range. So here it might be, on average, 1 in 15 years against minor overtopping, but it could be as low as 1 in 10 or as high as 1 in 20. Okay, with that, I shall pass back to Owen.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for that tour of the guide. So just a last final few slides just to sum up, and really pleased to see there's a lot of questions coming in and comments that we've got some time to pick up. So just to go through some of the key points in terms of why we've looked to develop new guidance. Well, I think we can recognise that there are some limitations with the old fluvial freeboard guide 187 in that it only covers fluvial situations. We've now advanced in tools and methods, and we've made this shift from flood defence to floodless management, and we should be using a broader range of options to both manage risk and uncertainty. And hopefully we've addressed this ambiguity and inconsistency between whether or not future uncertainties in terms of climate change and settlement rates, etc., are included as freeboard or actually taken account within the appraisal or the design process. So just to really quickly revisit the principles of the new guide. So we're saying Principle 1, challenge the credibility of the system components, and that means really just criticising your own assessment and your own models. Have you actually represented the key elements of the system that you're modelling, and where are the biggest uncertainties arising from? Principle 2, consider the present day reality, i.e. future uncertainties such as climate change are better addressed through the use of precautionary allowances or an adaptive managed approach. We're encouraging you to explore a range of measures to address your uncertainty rather than just a single dimensional response in terms of raising a crest level. We want you to be proportional, so we don't want people to analyse things to death, and we're saying that actually there is definitely a degree of proportionality to the need of managing uncertainties. And it's a continuous process, and as Paul mentioned, hopefully the guide makes a very clear handshake between the appraisal process and the design process. So hopefully the guide provides a clear hierarchical framework. There's certainly a lot of worked examples and vignettes and case studies within the guide, so if I can encourage you to look at those. We've provided methods for development planning, for the development of a strategy or scheme, and for reassessing the performance of existing defences. I'll reinforce this point in terms of implementation. This is a research output. It's there for guidance. We are certainly not asking projects that are underway to revisit any part of their case to try and take account of this new guidance. We would, however, encourage new projects to have a look at the guidance and discuss it with their clients. And the EA is going to be working to look to actually mandate this guide through our National Engineering Panel and our various communities of practice. The guidance can be found on .gov.uk by following that link, and as I mentioned, we'll be posting the recording of this webinar alongside that guidance too. Okay, so I think we'll move to some more questions. It was great to see so many questions coming in as we were speaking and talking through the guide. So I'll try and take them in some order. We're not going to be able to cover them all, but I'll take them in order of the methods as we talked through the methods. Does the Environment Agency plan to provide confidence scores supporting the information, or should these be derived through site-specific assessment? So I think I'll try and answer that one. So certainly as part of our implementation process, I think one of the options that we'd like to explore is just actually going through all of our data sets and actually assigning a certain confidence score. So areas would actually have that as a go-to piece of information to actually understand the confidence in the data that has been used. Next question on the development management approach, and I'll pass this one over to Fola if I may. Does this guidance apply to finished floor levels for planning applications? If so, is it applied to the difference between living and sleeping accommodation on the ground floor? Fola, can you pick up on that?
The idea is that will be linked to the planning process and the planning application. And yes, it is about it's what you add to the water level you're using, and whatever the planning system suggests that needs to be used for in terms of either the floor level, the threshold level, whatever that is. So this is not changing that. This is just providing a way of accounting for the uncertainty to allow you to deal with that in terms of development planning.
Okay, thanks, Fola. Just a quick one that I'll answer. How were the minimum depths derived for each star rating? So the first task that the project did was a complete literature review. So we looked at the literature within the UK and across internationally, and we used that literature review to set those depth linked star ratings. So they were representative of the typical prescribed allowances both in the UK and internationally. Okay. An important point here about floodplain scale and whether or not you've got a very broad, wide, unconstrained floodplain where small changes in water level or uncertainty in that water level won't result in great changes in depth versus smaller, steeper, more confined catchments. Can you, Fola, again come in on this one and just discuss perhaps issues of catchment scale and whether or not that's accounted for in the guidance?
The scale is accounted for within the guidance, because what one is doing is looking at the information for the model, understanding how things change, and getting an understanding for the uncertainties and the impact of the uncertainties on the actual information you've got. So the scale of that uncertainty, for example, if you are in a catchment that is responding very quickly to small changes, or you are at a point where even for quite a lot more flow, there's very little differences in water levels, then that will feed into your assessment of the residual uncertainty scale that you account for. Now, this is in the context of the scheme development and things like that. When it comes to the planning bit, unfortunately, it's difficult to get to that level of detail. So while we recognize that the initial information for the planning scale is based on the type of uncertainty and level of uncertainty, and not necessarily what that means in terms of figures, understanding of other things like that will feed into the discussion one has with the planning authority for the planning. But in terms of the actual design of defences, then you can apply that explicitly.
Okay, Taylor, thanks for that. And that is an issue that has been recognised by the project board, and certainly as we roll out this guide, it is likely that specifically for that issue around development that we might have to put some further guidance around there. And of course there's always the flexibility for that local information and that local discussion. Okay, another quick one on, and I think this is a comment, but there's elements of questions here as well. So with regard to assessing freeboard for planning applications, I assume the onus is on the developer and consultant to undertake the work and recommend a freeboard for our consideration. So that's the EA's consideration. This is additional work and uncertainty for our partnership and strategic overview teams to try and negotiate with developers in comparison to the existing situation. And the person that's put the question anticipates that this may increase the desire for pre-app from consultants. So there's a couple of really good points in there that I think it's worth reflecting on. Yes, I think we certainly consider the developer or the consultant to undertake the analysis and put a recommended residual uncertainty allowance towards us for consideration. Again, as part of our implementation process, I know the project board is recognised that this might mean further work for PSO, and we've got a lot of thinking to do to understand what the implications of that would actually be. And yes, there might be an increased desire for pre-app from consultants too. So I mean, there's quite a lot in that, and clearly there's more things that we need to think about as we roll the guide out. Okay, so I'm just scrolling through a few questions here. Sorry. Okay, and there's one on standard of protection that I think is well worth having a short discussion about here. So changes to communicating SOP is perhaps the biggest thing from the guidance and would need very careful discussion and thought before we adopt. So yeah, I'll just briefly say something on that, and again that's recognised by the project board, and we are actively thinking about that and actually working through what that, if we move towards that that range that the guidance recommends, what that would actually mean for us as a business. But no, Paul, I'd like to give you a chance to reflect on that. Can you just reflect on your view of the SOP change?
Yeah.
Paul, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Paul. Thank you.
Yeah. So I think the driver behind why we felt it was important to raise that question of SOP as being a range was, well, from an honesty perspective, we were writing a guide very much around acknowledging residual uncertainties existed, and both in the overtopping rate, for example, but also in what we consider as an overtopping rate that influences structural damage. So it was clear from the guide that there needed to be some way of representing that legitimate uncertainty. the second question of how you then take that into the business and communicate that is obviously a tricky question of how that's best done. But from the guide's perspective, it was clear that it would have been wrong to say at the end that standard of protection is still a deterministic statement, even though we've been talking about all of the uncertainties that go into supporting the assessment of overtopping and our knowledge of uncertainties around what thresholds of overtopping are important. So it was really around the honesty. One of the principles is trying to be clear on what those uncertainties are, and that ripples through to standard of protection.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Paul. Another one that I'm going to direct your way, Paul. I may have misunderstood, but it seems that all of the uncertainties are summed up and assumed to be coincident. Is this not a joint probability issue?
Yeah, so thanks for that. So there's two, in the simpler version, in the Tier 1 first order analysis and the first order approach, then they're assumed to be independent, not coincident, but independent. And that formula takes into account of that independence. I didn't talk explicitly about the formula, but that formula doesn't just sum them up. It's done on the basis that they are independent uncertainties. But if that assumption is poor for the range of things that are at a particular location, then the guide also talks about a more comprehensive Monte Carlo type simulation approach in which you could incorporate joint correlations in the uncertainties. So again, from our proportionate approach perspective, the first order analysis provides a quick way, and okay in most cases, providing those uncertainties are independent. But then the guide also talks about a more comprehensive approach, if you like, that adopts a more Monte Carlo, and into that you can play the correlations that you need.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Quite a specific question here on Thames Estuary. Just wondering how climate change will be taken into consideration along the tidal Thames, where the T2100 plan principles are currently being used. Now, I know obviously one of our case studies was with T2100 and Team 2100. Paul, again, sorry to continuously to pick on you at the moment, but can you just reflect back on that case study for us and perhaps try and answer that question?
Yeah, so I'm not, if I'm understanding the question correctly, then the climate change uncertainty is taken care of in the appraisal process, and that was in T2100 that thought about the adaptive plan. And then in the Team 2100 case study, they were focused more on the uncertainties in the current physical process understanding and in the condition of the defences. So again, in their case study, they did apply it very much as present-day uncertainties and not the future uncertainties that were taken care of in the E2100 strategy. So, in fact, the case study showed that quite well, that you don't carry forward the adaptive plan, if you like, into the present-day assessment of how you're going to deal with residual uncertainty. And if those residual uncertainties are too large for the present day, then they have to be passed back to the appraisal process. Rather than addressing them through an allowance, they have to go back into that appraisal process. So that does come across reasonably well, I think, in the T2100 and Team 2100 case.
Okay, thanks, Paul. loads of questions on the development management and the development application side. We're not going to get a chance to go through all of those, but we are pulling together a frequently asked questions sheet at the moment, so we will answer all of those questions. But I think the number of questions on that element of the guide is actually indicative of certainly where we've got to do the most thinking in terms of how we actually roll out and implement that. So really thank you very much for all of those questions. We'll be feeding those into the project board going forward, and very useful for our consideration on how to perhaps roll things out. One or two more that I will pick up on that I think are important questions for the team to answer. Again, Paul, sorry, scheme design here, so I'm going to push this your way. But for scheme design and assessment, should freeboard be removed when running computer models, e.g. for economic assessment? When would it be included?
No, so from the appraisal perspective, then you try and be quite clear in the guide that you incorporate the reality of the system. There's no removal of what you think of perhaps as the freeboard allowance that is embedded in that design. You don't do that. You appraise the existing system and take into account uncertainties of water level or crest level, but you don't try and extract out perhaps a previous designer's estimate of what the freeboard is. You look at what the reality of the system on the ground. And then if you can only consider a limited number of uncertainties in your appraisal, and you want to account for some more uncertainties that you haven't been able to consider in your appraising, then that adds cost to your appraised option, actually at the appraisal stage, and may modify the crest level at the appraisal stage. So hopefully then the handover to the design scheme stage has the correct, what you think of as your best estimate of what the final finished crest level, so there isn't a change in the finished crest level between appraisal and design, and there isn't a change in the cost, or the basis of the cost anyway.
Okay, thanks, Paul.
The short answer is it's to appraise the reality of the system without any second guessing of what the past freeboard allowances might have been and removing those. So the appraisal does it on the present system.
Okay, good question here and helpful prompt. Thank you on lead time for actually rolling out the guide and mandating. So the project board actually met last week specifically to start planning out that programme. So we're looking at certainly a year where we're hoping to identify some front-runner areas to start working with us to trial the guidance. And then we are potentially anticipating the need maybe for an implementation project in 18-19 as well. So it's going to be a while, and I think just recognising a lot of questions that we're seeing, there's quite a lot of thinking to be done during that process. Just one more I think is worth just reflecting on in terms of managing expectations as well. A question here saying, am I correct in saying that this guide is essentially for the post-modelling process and doesn't actually provide any bespoke methods for quantifying uncertainties? Polo, would you like to pick that one up?
Yes, that assumption is correct. While there are some examples at the back of the guide that might just, put in some suggestions on how you might go about things, the idea was not to provide sort of 6 steps to doing this and follow this. It's about the approach and the things you need to consider because it's very important that methods are changing all the time, and it's about the thinking and the way you go about it, and not something that will make the guide get out of date. So yes, I think that question is right in the sense that it doesn't give you those details.
And just to add to that, I think Fola's exactly right. We're not saying about the uncertainty on any individual, how to go about any individual component, but the guide does talk about how you might propagate those uncertainties through the system. So it talks about the Monte Carlo type approaches, and it talks about simulation-based sensitivity approaches. So at the more detailed modelling end, it does give you a bit of help of how you can propagate those uncertainties through the analysis. But Fola's exactly right. We don't talk about how you might best estimate the uncertainty of a crest level or from a 1D model or that kind of thing.
Just one final question. It's within a larger question, but I think I'll just separate this bit out just so we can deal with it. In terms of concern about significantly increasing appraisal and design costs with no real benefit. Paul, can you reflect on that question?
So I think in the limit, it should just be an expression of the uncertainties that you know about. So it doesn't actually demand any more work. But it does demand you to think about the uncertainties that might be relevant and then to think about how you've addressed them. It only requires more work if you then think in response to that, oh, gee whiz, I've got some important uncertainties here, how have I handled them? So there's no, it's very much on the onus of the user from the strategy and appraisal side to think through, well, what are my uncertainties, which hopefully they're doing already, and then when you see those, how do I address them?
Okay, thanks, Paul. We're getting very close to midday now, so I'm going to draw this to a close at this point. There was still a large number of unanswered questions. I recognise that. We will be answering those questions, and I will write to everybody that has registered their interest with a response to those questions. But all there is then left for me to do is to thank you all very much for your time. Really appreciate you listening in today and all of the valuable input in terms of questions and comments that you've provided. And hopefully you will hear from us very shortly. So thank you to my speakers, Fola and Paul, for your time, and I'll hopefully hear from you all soon. Okay, thank you.